Everyone feeling happy after last night? Okay, welcome again to our conference. This morning's panel is a panel devoted to infrastructure, and we're very pleased to be able to have Professor Lance Endersbee here this morning to discuss with us some of the infrastructure projects he has worked on conceptually that the building of would be of great benefit to Australia. Now, we've all seen the turmoil in the financial markets in the last few months. We've seen what's happened with the breakdown in the Southeast Asian economies. Those problems we've noticed have not been improving, and we also know that all this was forecast by Lyndon LaRouche. Now, LaRouche hasn't just forecast this global breakdown. LaRouche also has put forward an idea for a solution, which is his idea for President Clinton to convene a new Bretton Woods conference. The new Bretton Woods call that he put out basically has three parts. The first part is for a new Bretton Woods conference to redesign the global financial system, including put the existing institutions that are sort of trying to run the economy at the moment and obviously failing, put those into bankruptcy. The second part of his call is for national banking systems that can then, on a nationwide basis around the world, finance development. And the third part is for development. And in his call for development, LaRouche has called for the world to collaborate on the construction of the Eurasian land bridge. Now, anyone who's seen the report on that will know that the Chinese government, for example, has made that their top foreign policy priority, which is to build the Eurasian land bridge, and they're certainly building their end of it. Australia can contribute to this idea of the Eurasian land bridge, and there's probably no one better to explain when he talks about some of his ideas on that than Professor Endersbee. You know, just before I hand it over to the Professor, let me give you a little bit of background. Professor Endersbee was the Professor of Engineering at Monash University for a long time, but he has spent 40 years doing hands-on engineering work. Professor Endersbee worked for the Allied Works Council during World War II. He also worked on the Snow River Mountain Scheme. He worked on the construction of the hydro projects in Tasmania, and he's also spent a lot of time working in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and other countries, or as part of the United Nations program, building their schemes up there. So he is eminently qualified to discuss this question of infrastructure. I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I trust I'm being recorded okay. I feel quite privileged in being with you today because I'm so pleased to see democracy in action. I see problems at national and state level in the fairly monolithic approach of the major political parties. And as you'll see when I take you through what I have to describe, I have experienced problems in communication with both major political parties at federal and state levels. And I think the Australian democracy is in a pretty awkward state of affairs. It's almost paralysed. And there are fairly monolithic views. For that reason, I welcome the idea of groups such as yourselves contemplating putting your ideas into the national and state arena, and I think that is a good thing. I'm all in favour of people thinking through the issues, working out what they'd like to do, and making proposals, which is the sort of thing I've done all my life, and I felt a little bit lonely. And now I see you, and I'm delighted. 30-odd years ago, I was a United Nations advisor up in this part of the world, and as I'll show you later, I've been monitoring the growth and development in Asia for some time. And one of the projects I want to describe to you today is this project here, which is a fast rail system from the major parts of Australia through to Darwin, and then fast shipping to these ports. Oh, thank you. And the idea includes a high-speed rail freight system, say 250 kilometres an hour, and that's not too bad. That's fairly modest. In Europe, the fast trains, the TGV and others, are travelling at 350 kilometres an hour. The German IC Intercity Express is running at 250. So this is the same as the German Intercity Express, which is a freight and passenger system. And the idea is that we'll be able to have fast shipping between Darwin and Singapore and all these other places. To give you a clue as to the nature of the markets, there are 4 ports on the north coast of Java there. Those 4 ports on the north coast of Java are now moving as many containers per annum as Rotterdam, which is the major port for Europe. And that is 2 days sailing from Darwin. So we have a port, the capacity of Rotterdam just there, 2 days sailing from Darwin. Of course, Singapore is the largest port in the world. The second largest port in the world is Hong Kong, and the third largest port in the world is Kaohsiung in Taiwan. And so Darwin is within a few days sailing of the 3, and effectively, if you count Java as a port, the 4 largest ports in the world. The distance from Darwin to Singapore is the same distance as the length of the Mediterranean. The sea state is mostly fairly flat. In other words, it's calm seas most of the time. So that means we can contemplate fast ferries servicing these areas, and so we can have daily ferry services from Darwin to Java, Darwin to Singapore, and so on. That means we can be from Melbourne through to Darwin in less than a day, 2 days sailing, 3 days total. We've got a market of 100 million people, and other markets there in 3 and 4 and 5 days. So we can guarantee deliveries from Australia to what is effectively about the ports for 4 billion people. We can guarantee deliveries from Australia to those within 1 week. Our present system of shipping involves what are still effectively tramp steamers that go to several ports. So in Australia at the moment, because of the nature of our ports, our shipping system is still essentially a tramp type system. And if you have a look at the timetables of all the ships that come to Australia, you find that when a ship comes to Australia, they visit 3 or 4 ports in Australian waters, and effectively most shipping to Australia circumnavigates the continent. And of course, as you'll see later, the state-based system favours the idea of state-based ports and state-based rail systems. This is, to cut right through this is a total new transport system. It's not just a railway line, it's a new transport system for Australia. Because of the fact that these ships have to call at several ports in Australia, the sort of ships that serve Australia also call at several ports around here. So they have a, if you like, a schedule of about 6 weeks. And these ships are coming through, calling at several ports in Australia, calling at several ports in there, and their total turnaround time is about 6 weeks, port to port. So it very often means that Australian shippers shipping from Australia have, if you like, uncertain delivery times, but from here into Asia, it's a month plus. And it's very difficult to do anything other than that, because very often they're waiting for a ship here, and then that same ship calls at Sydney and Brisbane and so on. So this is a total transport system. And the opposition to this, as I've been finding over the last several years, are the state-based ports and railway systems, and believe it or not, the federal government. So why is it with a concept like this that I have received such strong opposition. As was mentioned, when I was a young man, I was graduating, I was taking my first qualification in engineering at Melbourne Tech, and I was manpowered into the Allied Works Council. A couple of us, we thought we were joining the sappers, which is, the army engineers. And so we thought we'd be joining the army engineers, and we were all ready for that. But the army said we were too well qualified to be sappers and we were too young to be officers, so we had to go into the Allied Works Council. So I was put into the Allied Works Council, and I worked on airports for the Americans, and I worked on ports for the Royal Navy that didn't turn up, and so on. But in the office, they were already starting to think about post-war reconstruction. And the Japanese threat had just frightened everybody so much that they realised at the end of the war they just had to be ready to develop the nation. And so they were already starting to think about that. And they had one experienced engineer from Tasmania, and he started work on looking at the potential development of the Snowy scheme to develop the waters, the coastal flowing waters of the Snowy River, and divert them inland for irrigation in the Murray-Darling Basin and so on. He was later joined by a couple of others. There was a fairly distinguished board of eminent engineers from the state instrumentalities in New South Wales and Victoria and the federal government. But the conceptual work of the Snowy scheme was done essentially by one man, later supplemented by a couple of others. And so the whole Snowy scheme went forward on the basis of some fairly detailed calculations. I used to see the work that was going on, very detailed studies. But within 4 years, they had a conceptual development of the Snowy scheme, which became the basis of the Act, which was introduced by the federal government. And so the federal government brought in 1949, the Act to construct the Snowy Mountain scheme. In 1949, I was also graduating in engineering at Melbourne University, and we were all thinking about the Snowy scheme, what a wonderful thing, and I was lucky to be appointed to the Snowy scheme. And I went to Sydney to join the organisation there at the beginning of 1950. And within a month or two, I was sent up to Spencer's Creek, here up near Mount Kosciuszko, and I was working on the investigations of one of the first dams that was proposed. It was in a glacial valley, and I was able to demonstrate that the foundations, I demonstrated fairly effectively that it wasn't a place for a dam, but, but anyway, that was my job. And so I was getting on with it, and a few months later, and in the snow time, the commissioner turned up in the snowcat, because we're right up in the snow country, and they use snowcats for communication. Rather than driving up in a motor car, he came up in a snowcat. So the commissioner came by with Dr. Savage, an eminent American engineer, and I showed them the work that I was doing, with tunnelling and shaft sinking and what have you, exploring the ground. And the commissioner congratulated me and sent me a very nice letter saying what a wonderful job I was doing, and I was just a young engineer. I had about 40 men in the camp, and a lot of German migrants and others, and problems that way, but we were getting on with the job. But the commissioner also said, in effect, get on with the job as hard as you can, young fella, before they stop us. Okay? Get on with the job as fast as you can, young fella, before they stop us. And what had happened is that there'd been a change in government, and the states of Victoria and New South Wales were saying, don't spend the money on the Snowy Mountains scheme, and don't spend federal money on developing electricity. It'd be far better to develop electricity in the Latrobe Valley or the Hunter Valley using Victorian brown coal or New South Wales black coal, and that the federal government did not have powers to develop electricity and sell it to the states. So they were saying the federal government does not have the power to build public works like that. And of course, not only were we developing electricity, we were diverting the waters inland to the Murray-Darling Basin, which covers all this, several states. It covers New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria and South Australia. So even though we were diverting water for irrigation to service all these states, the states of Victoria and New South Wales were moved, shall we say, to stop the project. And they were talking about going to the High Court to stop the project. If they had gone to the High Court to stop the project, the High Court would have been duty-bound to stop it and make the legislation illegal. But Menzies realised that the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution in 1900 and before that could not have foreseen a multi-state project like the Snowy Mountain scheme. So Menzies decided to tough it out. We continued to build the Snowy Mountain scheme, and it was 9 years before the states of Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia passed legislation, virtually one-line legislation, in effect endorsing the Snowy Mountains project as being a proper task for the federal government to undertake. So in other words, the states said, we approve of the Snowy Mountain scheme. It took them 9 years. We were building the scheme illegally for 9 years. But that was the last national project in Australia. That was the last. And from then on, the system has been paralysed. Australia has been paralysed. We cannot think of national development anymore or national infrastructure. The whole system is reduced to states and state development. And I'm finding that with this project which I am describing to you. Sorry. That project is now going ahead and will be built and funded by the private sector, and it will be the states that bring in the legislation. And so this project could be built as a joint activity of state governments without any reference whatever to the federal government. Oh, and that's not true. I've approached the Senator Heron for an exemption from native title. But you can see that and as I describe all these other projects, we do have a system which is strongly state-based. Now, here is the port and railway system in 1996, and this project that I'm proposing includes a rail system that goes up through the middle of New South Wales, picks up Mount Isa and goes through to Darwin. In proposing this project over the last 5 years, I have been totally opposed by every government in Australia, federal and state. The Queenslanders said that all freight generating in Queensland has to go out via the Queensland coastal ports. And when I made a submission to the RAN committee on the future of the port of Darwin, and I made my proposals, the Queensland government were minded to write a separate submission to the RAN committee looking at the future of the port of Darwin and saying that any connection between Mount Isa and Darwin and any connection through that way would not be easily approved by the Queensland government. The Queensland government said that all freight had to go that way, and that in view of the fact that South Australia and the Northern Territory desperately wanted the connection from Alice to Darwin, why not let them have that and don't bother us with this other route? So the Queenslanders said all freight has to go out via Queensland ports, and there's no way you can take stuff across from there to there. The New South Wales government said to me there was no way they would countenance a railroad connection north-south through New South Wales, because all country freight in New South Wales had to travel by New South Wales government railways and go out via the ports of Sydney and Newcastle. what was worse, they said to me, was that they've been spending $500 million on the coastal railroad through there, and if I persisted in this thing here, I'd have to find ways of reimbursing New South Wales for the $500 million that they're waiting on. You know, when you get correspondence like that, it makes you realise that these guys are serious. The Victorian government's approach all along has been Melbourne is the central port of Australia. Why try and take freight up to there when you've got Melbourne, the central port of Australia? The South Australians were saying, of course, that they were promised at the time of the Constitution, 100 years ago, that there would be a railway between there, and they are still waiting for it. And so I approached, I'm a former president of the Institution of Engineers and so on, and I've chaired various committees, and they've honoured me. I've got the highest award of the Institution of Engineers. And so I tossed it back to what I thought were my mates in the Institution of Engineers, and I said, why not the Institution of Engineers take this on as a national project? And so I referred it to the President and Council of the Institution of Engineers. It just so happened that the guys who were heading up the National Committee on Transport were a bunch of railway engineers over here, and they said that Fremantle was the logical port for Australian trade with Asia. And then, so I went back to the Feds, and I went to the Academy. I'm a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. I'm flying off this afternoon to the annual general meeting tomorrow in Sydney. And so I'll be chatting to my mates, my sort of mates, in the Academy. And so I tossed it in to the Academy. I said, why doesn't the Academy have a look at this thing? And so they discussed it with their mates in the, if you like, in the Canberra system, in the federal system. And lo and behold, the Federal Department of Transport, they're in the act of contemplating the sale and the privatisation of this railway through there, you know, the Sydney-Perth route, the Indian Pacific. And the official word was, there's absolutely no way the Feds would be prepared to contemplate a rival railroad through here when they're trying to flog this off to the private sector. So I got the raspberry from every government in Australia. That's where we should have thrown them. But anyway, so that is the reality of the political system in Australia. And nobody was really interested in my analysis of the economics of the project, all the details I've done. You know, in terms of professional work, I've done at least 5 years solid professional work on this, and prior to that I was working in Southeast Asia, and I've been looking at these economies in Southeast Asia for the last 30 years, and so I had an awful lot of background behind me, and what I was proposing was rational and proper for Australia, and as you can see, the political system wasn't equal to it. But what's worse is that neither were the bureaucrats, because with the move towards privatisation and the deprofessionalisation of the public service, there is virtually no capacity to lead within the bureaucracy anymore. And so, in other words, not only are they moving towards privatisation, they're moving to a point where the bureaucracy is relatively incompetent in relation to the national challenges. And that's a pretty serious state of affairs. So anyway, I pressed on. And on Friday, I gave a talk in Echuca, and there were all the farmers there. And I received wonderful support from the farming community. And it was a meeting of the National Party, who I say are also a little bit disenchanted. So you might be amongst friends with the Nats. And so this is my proposal here in relation to the Murray-Darling Basin and the green of the irrigation works. And I've done enough work on this project now to know that if this goes ahead, we'll have one train a day at least from the Murray-Goulburn-Echuca area. In other words, the farmers would be growing all the crops changing their cropping for that purpose. 1 train a day from here and 1 train a day from up there. We'd have at least 3 trains a day going through to Darwin just from this Murray-Darling Basin. And the reason why this happens is that our whole transport system is geared on state-based ports and state-based rail systems. Just remember that the rail systems in the states are different. In other words, we've got, as you know, we've got a broad gauge here, 5'3". We've got 4'8.5" here, and we've got 3'6" up there. So we've got different rail gauges in those 3 states. And it's those different rail gauges which, if you like, help to reinforce the position where Melbourne tries to be the port for that area there, Sydney tries to be the port for that area, and so on. So we have a problem there. At the same time, because of the fact that the Constitution gave these permanent powers to state governments and reinforced the state ports and rail systems, it means that the crops that we develop are what you call tyranny of distance crops. We only grow those things where time is not a consequence. Can you get the idea? The wool stockpile is a good example. It took us 3 years to flog the wool stockpile. Time was not a consequence. Wool will store, wheat will store, rice will store, cotton will store, canned fruits will store, dried fruits will store. So a lot of the things we make in Australia are what we call tyranny of distance crops. And we're moving to a stage where the world, with its supermarkets and fresh foods and everything else, doesn't play that game anymore. And so there's a whole set of new markets. And I've demonstrated that on this slide here, if I can push it up a bit. It always keeps creeping back. You can imagine that if we reduce the time or distance to market, the farmers can move up a profit curve. You can easily see that for things like grains and grazing and canned and dried fruits, that time and distance to market are not critical, but also the returns on the investment are low. Okay, amen? Amen. But as you move towards intensive horticulture, fresh fruit and vegetable and shelf life foods, the profits are greater. And we've got farmers in Australia trying to get over this tyranny of distance. Down in Kooyurup, they're sending asparagus to Japan by air. And they're climbing over a hurdle of $4 a kilogram just to get that asparagus into Japan. But there's a whole range of possibilities. So as soon as I present that chart, and I've done that down in Gippsland to the farmers in Gippsland, and just on Friday night to the farmers in Echuca, they wouldn't let me go home on Friday night. They all wanted to chat to me. And they saw this immediately, and they realised what it would mean to them. Now, a lot of Australian farmers are close to the breadline right now, and they have to think of ways of improving the viability of their farms. And they realise that this sort of thing isn't getting them very far. They've got to move up market, and the markets are there, as I will demonstrate here. Now, in looking at the markets, just remember that the largest ports in the world, if we change that to Java, the largest ports in the world are close to Australia, and this is what we're now putting through the Port of Melbourne. And when you read the annual reports of the Port of Melbourne Authority, they say how they're going up at 1 or 2 or 3% a year, and the port is improving all the time. Well, the real question is, how's the port going in relation to the potential market? And that's my assessment of where Melbourne is heading. And this is a log scale. I'm sorry, if you don't understand log scales, I'm going to have to take you through it step by step. But I plot things in orders of magnitude. This is 1, 10, 100, the next thing would be 1,000. It's easy to work that way. If something is growing at, say, a constant, say, 5% a year, it'll plot as a straight line on this sort of a graph. So, in other words, and they're growing at 15 and 20% per year. So, Hong Kong and Singapore, TEUs are containers. Whenever I refer to TEUs or million TEUs, that's a million standard containers, 20-foot equivalent unit container. So, here's this is in million containers per annum. That's the way Hong Kong and Singapore have been growing from, here we are, 1984 through to my latest date there. And that's the ratio of Melbourne. So we are, every year, we're getting a smaller and smaller proportion of the available market. So we have to say, what on earth are we going to do about it? And of course, we only have to have a look at the way some of our own crops are performing. The market for canned peaches has fallen away. People want fresh peaches these days, and we can't get there because we haven't got the transport system. How many people in the room buy canned peaches these days? Oh, good on you, Tony. Oh, well, the people in Shepparton will be pleased. But the market is decreasing. So, canned peaches. On the other hand, the Asians love plums. There's our, that's the way plums are going. So, and I've done several of these. We hear talk about the problems of the citrus growers and the juices and everything else. But I can tell you that juice is a tyranny of distance product, because people can freeze it and keep it. Fresh is not. Australian exports of fresh citrus are going up. People like to get our fresh fruit. And you see all these Californian oranges in the supermarkets here. Just remember that at the other time of the year, our oranges are in California. So we're exporting fresh citrus to the world. And we just have to have the transport system. So, okay, in my discussions with governments, and you've heard me referring all the time to the tyranny of distance, one of the things I've found out is that governments generally in Australia do not value time in the private sector. As far as governments are concerned, there's a government cost, there's a cost of something, and that's it. And if there are other costs in the private sector due to the fact that governments are tardy or things don't happen or transport is slow, that is of no consequence to the governments, federal and state. A good example is the return on your Medibank and Medicard. You go to see the doctor, his time's valuable, but then yours is not, and it might take you a couple of days to get your own money back. So, in other words, why, and I feel this, why should the doctor's time be more valuable than mine? And I object to this, and I feel the system should be such that time in the private sector is valued for what it really is. And that applies particularly if you're in the agricultural game, and if you're shipping shelf-life foods, for example. Let us assume that you're shipping shelf-life, or trying to ship shelf-life foods to Hong Kong or Singapore. Time is valuable. And you can see how much time is valuable in the supermarkets by the supermarket freight trucks going up and down the main highways. They don't wait for people. And within the supermarket industry, their time on the great bulk of their products is at least 1% of the value of what's in that truck every day. 1% a day. Sometimes more than that, 2, 3, 4% a day. So you see them hurtling from farm to market. The same applies for just-in-time deliveries in the manufacturing sector. Now, I've got a lot of mates in manufacturing in Melbourne, say within the automotive industry, and they're supplying component parts for Toyota and Holden and what have you. when they write a contract with Toyota and Holden, those contracts are written for specified deliveries on the hour, months ahead. And on the hour, the trucks turn up to take delivery of those components, and off they go to the automotive assembly firms. Now, you can imagine that if one of those component suppliers is a day late, or 2 days late, and if they then have to stop the production line, they're stopping a production line which may have cost them $500 million to build, and they've got all sorts of other component suppliers, and they've got materials building up in their warehouses that they don't want. So the automotive assembly industry is based on a whole chain of suppliers, and the whole system ticks like a clock. And it ticks like a clock on schedule months ahead. And so time is valuable. If one of my mates in the manufacturing sector is late with a delivery, he knows he may not have a job next year. Time is valuable. Now, it's tremendously valuable in the private sector. Governments don't want to know about it because they haven't got a mechanism for funding time. And so I demonstrate here that if we have depreciation and capital costs of 1% a day, and that is, in other words, in 100 days your goods are worthless, and that applies to a lot of things that you're trying to sell. So if in 100 days your goods are worthless and you're sending Melbourne to Hong Kong, one of your options is air freight, and it costs you that much to send a container load by air. One of your options is conventional container shipping, and this is where all the conventional economists come in. You see, they say, oh, it's going to cost you $3,000 to get it to Darwin, and we can ship it out of Melbourne for $1,000, $1,500. So why would people spend $3,500 to get it to Darwin when you can ship it from Melbourne at that price there? And the answer is in this, because if your goods are depreciating with time, you want to get there quickly, and an awful lot of the people these days, because of this system that I'm proposing doesn't exist, they say, oh, I'll blow you, and they go straight there and they send it by air freight. So we're sending a lot of stuff by air freight at the moment, which is fairly costly. And so this project competes with air in cost, and it competes with conventional container shipping in time, and that's the saving. So if you've got say a container load of chocolate-coated ice cream, can you imagine the market in Asia for chocolate-coated ice cream? There are 4 billion people out there. The population in the world is increasing by about 80 million a year. And so just assume that 50 million of that is in Asia. And those kids are growing up and watching television. If every kid, say 5 years of age in Asia, was allowed 1 chocolate-coated ice cream per annum, 1 chocolate-coated ice cream per annum, or even 1 chocolate-coated ice cream in his lifetime, we'd be running a train a day filled with chocolate-coated ice creams. But I mean, you've got to get the idea of the magnitude. But these are savings, and when the farmers in Echuca saw this, they knew exactly what I was talking about, because that's real money to them. And so these farmers that are on the breadline at the moment, they can't afford to pay wages of staff to help them. And so because they can't afford to pay staff, they're just working themselves, 18 hours a day. They see this and they want to be amongst it. And they see it as the saving of their farms. Now, that is that. I can show you others. Melbourne to Jakarta, similar savings and so on. And basically, what this chart shows is the total cost. What's the total cost to the farmer? Oh, I must have... sorry, it's buckling. Anyway, this is looking at... Thank you. This is looking at total costs here, and that is not only the cost of the freight, but the cost of time. And you can appreciate that the cost of time is greater depending on the value of the product that's in the container. You're likely to lose more money with delays with a $400,000 load in the container than you've got $100,000. So the value of time is dependent on those costs. And that's the sort of savings we can make. And you can see I've got there the past and others. Now, just going back to it all, by going through that sort of exercise, I was able to work out the total volume of freight, and I find up in this area here, I need double track. Because we're bringing in Phosphate Hill, and we'll be bringing phosphate from there back to the farmers. We'll be exporting phosphate to people over here. We'll be exporting copper, lead and zinc ores this way. We'll be integrating with Timor Sea oil and gas here and bringing fuels back into Australia. The manufacturers in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane will be integrating their activities with manufacturers over here. And just remember, there are 800,000 people engaged in manufacturing in those cities there, and their future depends on integration with manufacturers around the world. Now, you've heard an awful lot about microeconomic reform and all the rest of it. Just remember that they're trying to compete with integrated industries over here, and if these guys do not have access to those markets, they're going to go backwards. Now, in Victoria, we've got things like the casino, we're going to put a football stadium, but I can tell you, just remember that the population of Melbourne is 3 million people, and the reason for 3 million people in Melbourne is manufacturing in the outer suburbs. It is not the central business district. And these clowns who say, Melbourne's going to be the financial capital of Australia, well, Zurich is the financial capital of Europe and of the world, and it's about 100,000 people. You don't need a big city to be a financial capital. That's nonsense. 3 million people depend on manufacturing in the outer suburbs. And unless we preserve that, Victoria's going to be in great difficulty. And we're pretending we're doing the work of the Lord in building the casino and now a football stadium. But I can tell you, manufacturing is critical. So this includes manufacturing, exports. And so all of those add together, and I've been able to demonstrate that the project is quite economic. And so what happens? I won't get there yet. I'll just go. Oh, no, I will. Pardon me. So the project's economic. At the beginning of this year, a chap rang me up from Queensland. He said, "Are you still pushing that project of yours?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, a couple of us heard you speak in Brisbane. I said, "Oh, yes." He said, "We think we've got the money." Now, this is $10 billion and $5 billion for single track. So I said, "Well, it's going to cost you $5 billion for single track, but the project I want to build is about $10 billion. He said, "We think we've got the $10 billion. And sure enough, they have. And they're proposing to build this, and I've been saying all along that the project was so good it was commercially viable as a private enterprise project, because I was getting fed up with blockages by government. So this group of people have put together a consortium, and they reckon they've got the $10 billion and they want to get on with the job. And they're saying to me now that there's no point in them talking to the federal government, because the federal government hasn't got any powers to do anything, and they're immobilised. But they're talking to the Queensland government, the New South Wales government, the Victorian government and the Territory. They're making a nice cosy arrangement with the Queensland government, and as you know, governments like cosy arrangements. And the great advantage of this is that, and now I'm describing what is happening, not what I would like to do myself. Okay? But what is happening is that they are entering into a cosy arrangement with Queensland. They're diverting the line around just to go through a few things to pick it up on the way past. And so Queensland is likely to give them a concession to build that section of the railway line in Queensland. They're negotiating with New South Wales for a concession to build that part of the railway line in New South Wales, and they're negotiating with the Victorian government for a similar deal. Now, the advantage of the concession arrangement is that the governments don't have to think or call tenders. It's a bit like the casino. You just enter into a contract with one of your mates. But that means, you see, the bureaucrats love this. And so here's the private sector coming along with $10 billion, and they are moving quite seriously, and this is likely to happen early in the new year. There'll be an announcement that this project is approved, and there's been a quiet, cosy arrangement with all of the state governments involved, and no tenders will have been called at all for a railway line which will determine the future of the nation. Now, I'm in the awkward situation, whereas I want that railway line because I think the country desperately needs it. And if that's the only way to get it, well, so be it, but it's not the way I would have done it myself. I'm an old public service engineer of the Snowy and the Hydro and the United Nations, and governments didn't do things that way when I was a boy. But the nation needs it, and so it's going ahead. I've then, of course, been thinking of other projects, and I'm finding that I'm having a similar response, which worries me further. Let If the Asian Express Rail project goes ahead, and I called it the Asian Express, let me put that down there. Can you hold it down again? I've been, thank you. I need it to that flat there. This there. That's it, good on you. Now, up there is the catchment of the Clarence River, and it's a wonderful little cup in there, and very steep country, high rainfall, and one of the highest rainfall areas in Australia. And they get the summer rains from the monsoons coming down, and they get the winter rains as well. So there's a lot of rainfall there, and it all flows out to the sea. And if you've been to Grafton, you know how wide the Clarence River is in Grafton. It's a big river. So I've designed a scheme for the diversion of the Clarence into the Darling. Now, as you know, there's a lot of algae in the Darling, and I've coloured it green there. And you can see that this would flush all the algae out of the Darling. I've designed this as a pumped storage scheme. There's a surplus of thermal energy, coal-fired thermal energy from the Hunter and the Latrobe Valley, and there's a surplus of thermal energy on the national grid. And the national grid just goes right through there, just past the project. And because there's a surplus of thermal energy on the national grid, and because of the fact that they're running coal-fired thermal stations, which take a long time to warm up, you get the idea? And once they're operating, they like to keep on operating. And so we've got this surplus of thermal energy overnight and at weekends. And so the thermal power station operators, with the creation of the national grid, things are all right with the, if you like, with the integrated state systems, but once they're on the national grid, these, and particularly the international operators that have now bought into the power system, they were offering negative prices for overnight and weekend power. In other words, they would pay you to take their electricity, to run your factory overnight and at weekends. And of course, this was pretty much a bonanza. But the whole object of it was that if you ran your factory overnight and at weekends, they were able to, and they supplied, these thermal power stations supplied you with the power. Somebody else in the system had to shut down, and if you've got a thermal power station with sort of being fed by boilers and it's all hot and what have you, once it cools down, it might take you another day or so to get it warmed up again. So by offering negative prices overnight and weekends, they were deliberately trying to put their opposition out of business. And so things got pretty ruthless. And of course, I've been a member of the Energy Council down there in Tasmania, and we've been looking very seriously at a Bass Strait cable. And so I knew that there was a surplus of thermal energy overnight and at weekends. And so with this Clarence diversion, rather than tunnelling through the mountains, I could pump it up the hill. And so I've devised a scheme whereby we pump at overnight and at weekends, and we generate at peak times on the way down the hill. And the project's economic. And so I've been working on that. And but the worst is yet to come. So the project's economic, and that's the sort of thing. It involves dams and pumps and head storages here on the Great Divide near Tenterfield, and then another dams and power station going down the hill. My wife doesn't like this chart because it's highly exaggerated, but I do it for engineering reasons, not for public display. But you see, this is a highly exaggerated vertical scale. But there's the Pacific Ocean down there, and here's the cascade of storages. We pump up the hill, we have a head pond there, and we generate down that way. Now, lo and behold, along comes Coopers and Lybrand. And they say to me, how'd you like to have lunch? You get the idea? And Coopers and Lybrand say they're going to conduct a study. And and when I told the farmers about what was happening, because I pointed out to the farmers in Echuca that Coopers and Lybrand were well aware of the fact that the water, I could pay for this that project on the basis of power costs and power charges alone, and the water came free for nothing. And Coopers and Lybrand were doing the sums, and they realised that there was a volume of water comparable to the Snowy scheme being diverted into the Murray-Darling Basin, which you can value at a minimum charge of $20 a megalitre. And the farmers laughed at me on Friday night. $20 a megalitre, 100. That's the way the game is moving. Water is extraordinarily valuable out there in these areas. And so Coopers and Lybrand seem to be on a bonanza. And one of my lawyer friends has told me I've got to claim my rights on this project just to defend the nation. But this is a pretty serious state of affairs. Once again, this is a project which I've worked on, which is likely to go ahead in the private sector because it is hugely profitable. Now, let me just go back to my previous picture and give you a clue. It's hugely profitable, and so what happens when I approach the New South Wales government? Okay, you ready? They say, there's no way we would approve of this scheme. We wouldn't want to divert good New South Wales water so that we have to share it with Queensland up in here and Victoria down there in South Australia. And one of the protocols of the Murray-Darling Basin is that they now have to sell the water to the highest bidder, and it'd be pounds to a peanut that Adelaide would want some of that water. So the New South Wales people are saying to me, there's no way they're going to divert that so that it flows down to Adelaide. So we're one nation, aren't we? Okay, there's a few more. We'll break for morning tea in a minute before I get on with the hard bit. Now, I've been looking at the Fitzroy River over here. And if this Asian Express rail and shipping project goes ahead, all of a sudden these areas here are very valuable for irrigation purposes, because we're going to have ships leaving every day from there or from here or there, serving these ports. And so one of the great projects is the Fitzroy River. This Fitzroy River here is the biggest river in Australia in terms of annual flow and annual floods. Huge quantity of water. And there's some wonderful dam sites there. And so I've been proposing and talking to the Western Australian government about this, and I've been suggesting, I think, that in the Great Sandy Desert here, down in there, I think I could develop at least 500,000 hectares of irrigation. And this is probably one of the best sites in the world for major scale, highly mechanised, intensive horticulture. The growth of supermarket type foods on a grand scale in a highly mechanised way. And you've got huge areas under irrigation, and you can design it as a massive project. And so I was sort of selling these ideas to the Western Australian government. But it just so happens in this area here, where I was proposing the project, there are at least 50 claimants under native title. So the Queensland government, the Western Australian government decided that they would offer the entire project to the private sector so that the Western Australian government doesn't have to negotiate with the natives, the private sector does. And it gets an awful lot of political problems off the agenda in Western Australia. Now, I'm going to say a few words more about native title, but I think native title is an absolute abomination. And what you've got to do is to just sort of go back and abolish the whole concept, because we can't have two nations. And so... But this could be one of the most valuable projects in Australia. And I'm finding that the Indonesians are starting to get interested in it, of course. And of course, you can imagine the prospect of the natives if the Indonesians get in to run this project. They're not likely to be quite as generous as other people, and they could be, a pretty rough group. They've got no problems with reconciliation. So, anyway, just remember there are these projects that go ahead. And the Roman Catholic Church have been chatting to me. And they are concerned about the future of the nation and the future of families and things like that. And when they hear me talking about this sort of thing, they say to me, how many million people there? And they are quite deliberately thinking that from the point of view of national security and the family life and jobs for young people and so on, we might have to think in terms of an additional 20 million people or more in Australia. And this is the sort of thing whereby we can mobilise that. But if, on the other hand, we're just going to hand it all back to the Aborigines, we're going to have awful strife. And just let me say a few things. Down here, there's always the possibility of a major oil field strike. Can you imagine if you had the equivalent of Timor Sea oil and gas or the Northwest Shelf suddenly popping up down here? And when you think of the billions and billions of dollars that have been invested offshore, if we get anything onshore there, can you imagine? We could have Aborigines with a lifestyle on $100 million a year each. We've got to, and but let's assume that sort of thing happened. Can you imagine how difficult all the other native people are going to be? If they've got mates over here that are collecting a few $1 million a year, that's going to be par for the course. So it's, I can tell you, it's going to get rougher. So I've got another project. I've got two more projects to show you, and then we'll break for lunch. Well, break for morning tea. And I've got to get the plane to Sydney. One of the other projects I've been thinking about is a development road from here over near Udnadatta right through to Port Hedland. Now, at the present moment, here's the road system, and there's a road connection through there. And so most of the connection with that area is through here. This is mostly untouched. But that area there, the Musgrave, from my examination of the geophysical data, the gravity and the magnetic stuff and what have you, the Musgrave Ranges there are every bit as prospective as the Mount Isa Inlier. All of that Mount Isa area. Now, the Mount Isa area is very extensive, and all the signs are that could be a fabulously wealthy area. It just so happens that that's the Pitjantjatjara people. And when I've raised this, and they own the lot. And so you have a mad situation where the Pitjantjatjara people have a native title claim over an area that is going to be as valuable and possibly more valuable than the entire Mount Isa complex, where you've got about 24 mines. You've got Prospect Hill and Cannington, and, you know, some of the biggest mines in the world are in there. And this could be similar. Anyway, and that is restricted exploration, the remoteness of the area and the thing. Well, I'm speaking in Perth on the 1st of December, and I'm going to be putting to the Premier of Western Australia that that project should go ahead anyway as a developmental road and let the mining companies get on with it. Now, finally, and this is related before we break for a break, we really haven't properly explored our own country yet. Now, here's the Murray-Darling Basin, and that brings in about all the irrigation works and everything else, and propped up by the diversion of the Snowy Scheme. That's worth about $10 billion a year, the income from the activities in that area there. And you can imagine that supports a lot of people. You see that there? That is a similar catchment. And there's an ancient river system under there, and flowing out to the sea there, and it's all been sanded up. And the rain that falls on this area soaks into the ground, and so there are huge water storages under there, and the water is slowly percolating out to the sea through there. Now, these are, you know, paleo channels, ancient river channels, an ancient river system, and the groundwater is there, and it is fresh, and that area there, I think, in terms of volumes of water and potential, could have a potential almost equivalent to the Murray-Darling Basin. And it's just a matter of sort of doing an awful lot of work to plan and work out the, if you like, the geology of it, mapping. And we can these days, we've got all these seismic techniques. You don't have to drill, you can just put seismic cover over the lot. You'd have a map of the pre-existing ground level down there, you know, where all the old channels were and everything else. You could do an awful lot of work on that, and I think it is potentially valuable as a major irrigation province. And that's another thing we could do, and that is support a few more million people. Now, they're the sort of things we can do in Australia if we can solve the political problems of trying to put the power where work can be done. We've now created a system in Australia whereby governments, federal and state, are powerless to act. The only people that can move are the private sector, and governments are cheering them on, and that means that governments have lost the capacity to lead, and I'm not too sure where it's going to head. And so, once again, I welcome a group like yours who can think for themselves and don't follow the passions of the major parties. Because what they're talking about at the moment, microeconomic reform and all the rest of it, with a whole lot of catchphrases, it's fashionable doctrine. Thank you very much. Now, that's the first half. How am I going for time? Okay. You got another thing? You got another one? Oh, only halfway. Give him a break. Now, up till now, I've been talking to you about the Australian side of these projects that I'm looking at. Now I want to direct your attention to the international markets, the market that exists out there for Australia, and the way we are relating to those markets. Now, I know from some publications that Craig and others have sent me that you subscribe to some of the views of Lyndon LaRouche. Now, I want to let you know that I am not 100% in line with Lyndon LaRouche, but I understand what he's talking about, and you will find that what I'm saying and talking about is rather similar to Lyndon. But I'm approaching it from a slightly different direction. And so, okay, I want to talk to you about the work of the world. Lyndon LaRouche talks about the physical economy, and I talk about production. I'm an engineer, I'm interested in production. And if we have a look at the way in any firm, in governments or within any organisation, those of you that are in the private sector will recognise this. A certain proportion of the total cost is involved with production, actually building and making things. And that includes inputs and outputs, and production is an orderly process. Now, in the last month or so, and with this sort of thing, the financial collapses, as you can see, the financial system goes up and down like a fiddler's elbow, and it's been going down pretty rapidly in the last few months. Shares in, say, BHP have nosedived. And you've got to ask yourself the question, well, those shares in BHP have gone down, what has happened to production? Have they changed the volume of steel they produce by month by month? No. Production is continuing and is probably increasing. So here's production might be continuing in an orderly fashion and even increasing, and the share price goes down. And it's all related to the expectations of profit. And profit is variable. And so we have production with inputs over here, outputs over there. Then within any firm there are overheads, you know, the office girl and all the rest of it. And there are taxes on profits. By the way, these overheads include government charges like workers' compensation and all the rest of it. All those government charges there. Then there are taxes on profit, you know, the ordinary company tax. And then finally there's profit. And so because of the various things in here, and because the price you get for the commodities varies a bit, the profit goes up and down, but the firm in effect tries to shield the production side of the operation from those similar fluctuations. It's in their economic interest to have a fairly orderly production. So production is orderly, profit is variable. The valuation of the firm by the financial markets of the world is highly variable. And this is what LaRouche is talking about. He's talking about this high variability in the financial markets. So, okay, I'm happy to leave that area to LaRouche. And I'm going to talk to you now down here. I'm an engineer. I'm interested in the inputs, the electricity, fuels, transport, and imports, and production, and exports and what have you. I draw your attention to the fact that trade is related to production. Trade's not related to overheads or taxes or profits and things like that. If you're building and making things, you're dependent on imports. You have imported components. And if you're building and making things, you're supplying a domestic market and your exports. So the trade of the world is fairly orderly and fairly steady, and that depends on production. So I'm going to take you now through a vision of the world. If all you're doing is thinking about production, and these guys up here are playing their own games, and that's irrelevant to, not strictly irrelevant, but I'm trying to point out that it has less impact on this down here. Now, people are going to say to me, the Southeast Asian markets have dropped and Korea has gone. Don't you worry about that. If the Korean currency drops like a stone, can you imagine what the price of Korean cars is going to be in Australia? Cheap and cheap and cheap. So if the Malaysian currencies and the Indonesian currencies go down, can you imagine the price of their goods in world markets? So because they are, if you like, they've overreached themselves and they've valued their property markets too high, and there's a few rich people in Southeast Asia and Korea who've thought they are terribly rich, the value of their currency goes down, and lo and behold, their exports expand. So get ready for it. Production is orderly, and it goes on. Now, the same applies to nations. But we have different systems. And if we look at Australia and gross domestic product, as a nation, we have our production and our agriculture and our services. And here in Australia, our producers are carrying the burden of almost 70% services. Do you get the idea? In China, they're carrying the burden of 31% services. So when they all talk about microeconomic reform and the level playing field, just remember that the Chinese competitors are carrying a less burden of services. Now, one of our problems is that we're banging our industries over the head, and a lot of our people over the head, and you've got to say, you've got to be internationally competitive. The sad thing is we're saying to these people, they've got to be internationally competitive, but we don't say that to that lot. And so we've got a national problem. And we've got this similar sort of thing in Indonesia, and there's the United States. Their position is even a little worse than us. And so when LaRouche is talking about problems in the financial markets, the problems in the financial markets are mainly here and there. And somehow or other, those markets are going to have to learn to improve their production and reduce all the goods and things that the people vote for. Now, what is happening is that the governments have been promising goodies to the people, and the people have voted for it, and the nation can't afford it. And so that is a real problem. And so now I'm going to show you what the world looks like if instead of looking at gross domestic products, we just look at production worldwide. What sort of a world is it if we just look at production? Now let's assume that you're a man from Mars, and you're looking at the world, and we see the world ticking like a clock. The man from Mars wouldn't understand dollars or gross domestic product, but they would understand things like energy, work, power, slaves. So in other words, they would say, how much energy are you using? How much power is under your control? So let's look at it if we're thinking about how much power is available at the workplace. Now, I've been looking at these things for 30 years, over 30 years. And here's something that I did 30 years ago, over 30 years ago. I was a United Nations advisor in Thailand. And here we are. In 1964, I made a projection for long-term energy production in Thailand. And I think I've got it through to 1995 there. Now, I had the family there, and we were working in Bangkok and up and down the Mekong River, and we were in Laos and Cambodia. But I had to leave with the family because things got a bit dicey, and there was a parachute drop on one of the dam sites I was working on, and I didn't like it. And on one of the other dam sites I was going to go and visit, I couldn't visit because some guerrillas in the jungle were taking pot shots at the drilling shed in the middle of the river. And if you're sitting in a drilling shed drilling the foundations for a dam, and you hear a whine, ping, and it goes through the galvanised iron. I wasn't too keen to actually go out and row out and have a look at the drill core. So I came home with the family. But I had done enough work to predict that sort of growth for Thailand. Now, I was a bit wrong here, and that's all the lights in the fancy houses that entertained the American troops in Bangkok during the war period. You understand that, don't you? But at the end of the war, things got back to normal. But you can see That's not a bad projection from me in 1964 looking at 1995. I was pretty much on the ball. And you'll see now the way I can do these things. And one of the other things I can do is, in looking at the world as a whole, once again, if you're a man from Mars, you find that world growth in electricity usage is just ticking along, steadily increasing year by year. The population of the world is increasing, the use of electricity is increasing, and this world growth in electricity is equal to 2 Australias each year. Now, you just think of all of this greater Melbourne, all of the buildings and cities, all of the factories. You just think of that right throughout Australia. The world at the moment is growing in terms of this sort of industrial output at 2 Australias per annum. The world population is increasing at 80 million people per annum. So 2 Australias in industry is pretty okay if the population's going up like that, and you can imagine that the population that is going up like that wants to have an even greater slice of the cake in time to come. So the world is growing at 2 Australias per annum. That is, just bear that in mind. Now, most of the growth is in the developing countries of the world, and the rich countries of the world have been getting into strife progressively. Now, I have found in my work, I can easily divide the world into 2 parts, the rich and the poor. There are the developed regions of the world, USA, Canada, Japan, Australia, Europe, Eastern Europe, the former Russia. The developing regions, Asia, Latin America, Middle East. Japan is included in that group there. Now, if you look at the world in these 2 parts, you can see that there's a fairly reasonable and expected change. The rich countries are progressively flattening out. Their potential growth is less and less, and most of the growth in manufacturing in the world is in these developing regions. Most of the population increase. This 80 million per year is going here. This group here are not increasing in population from their ordinary growth. So static populations, growing industries. And so the world is already divided into 2 parts, and in terms of population, there's less than 1 billion there and there's about 5 billion there. So it's huge numbers. Now just remember that when there are such huge numbers, they don't move out of line very quickly. With 5 billion people, there's an awful lot of momentum. And so when I make my studies and I update my charts regularly every year, I just did it last month, sure enough, the data goes pop right there, and I don't have to change my projections because everything's moving according to plan. Not the plan, but there's a momentum in the world. Now, our Western governments have not been able to live with this reality. And the memories of people are of the wonderful times back here in the 60s and 70s and 50s and what have you. And as this has gone over, the Western governments have been trying to convince their people that everything is going to be all right, and they call out the growth and the gross domestic product and so on. And they vote all sorts of benefits to people on the basis that things are going to improve. But the reality is that things may not be improving, and we've built up a whole range of expectations which are going to be enormously damaging to us, and this is the reason why the political system in Australia is absolutely paralysed, because governments have promised things to the people on the basis that that would keep on going like that. It's turned over flat. Their industries are battling to compete with these. We've got problems in manufacturing, and of course governments dream up things like casinos in order to keep the people happy. And so the responses of governments to this sort of world economic reality is less funds for public infrastructure. Funds for public infrastructure have halved, more than halved, in the last 20 years. So we don't spend anything on public infrastructure. What's worse is that there's no money for maintenance. And if you do build anything, it's got to have a quick return because it might disappear. So there's no long-term planning of public infrastructure. It's useful to remember that virtually the entire physical structure of our economy, the roads and the streets, the water supply, the sewage and the drains and all the rest of it, the telecommunication system, our airports and our railways and our ports, all of those were built by patient investment by governments. Now, governments are vacating the entire field. Every one of those that I've mentioned is now going off to the private sector. Water supply, you know. The rain comes down from heaven and it's owned by the private sector. And so on. So there's less funds for public infrastructure because they can't plan, things are going crook, so they spend more money on social welfare. And as a result, they have increased taxes. We now have a situation where taxation matters are very often the most critical decision of a business enterprise. Investment decisions and everything else. Taxation matters are absolutely critical. What a mad situation. Here they are, a mining company or something else, you're a manufacturer here in Melbourne, and what do? The board of directors talk about? Taxation. What a mad state of affairs. You can't plan to build anything, taxation. So we have more funds for social welfare, and taxes are a critical factor in business decisions, in government decisions, and they all talk the same language. Microeconomic reform, you know. Taxation is a key factor in business decisions. They have deficits in government budgets. They then start to sell off the public assets. If your firm is going bankrupt, you start selling your property. You know, if you're a manufacturer around here in Coburg and you happen to own the building in which you're working, you sell off the building and you lease it back. So that's what we're doing, selling off our public assets and leasing them back. And we sell them to foreigners, so we get more money coming into the country. We sell off the gold reserves. You know, they say that was a sort of rational business decision. It's still selling off the family to silver. We have encouragement of gambling and sport as a tax resource. An awful lot of the thinking of the present government in Victoria is related to those two things. Gambling and sport as a tax resource. Increased reliance on the private sector and decline in education and more finger painting. We entertain the kids by finger. That's what it is, isn't it? Eh? Why don't you call it what it is? Okay, more finger painting at university level everywhere. More finger painting. Now, one of the problems is that because of all of these things, there's a vast difference in the annual behaviour. And this is where these financial markets go up and down like a fiddler's elbow. And here are the rich nations of the world on an annual basis, and you don't know where they're going to be from one year to the next. They're up and down like a fiddler's elbow, but the poor nations of the world are just steadily growing. And this is where the growth is, and this is where the great uncertainty is. And this great uncertainty is going to lead to something like that. So, okay, let's now say, and this is going to be tricky now, this is where you're going to earn your crust. Now, you remember the chart I showed you of this data here? Remember that? Okay. Now, I've got a sort of mathematical fiddle I can do now. And I can recognise that. This is because of my training and the sort of things I've done in my whole life. I can look at that and I can say that they are the same sorts of curves as you'd get for a competition, a struggle of the fit, a survival of the fittest, a struggle for supremacy of a bunch of microbes in the test tube, which is reasonable, for 5 billion and 1 billion. That's the sort of thing you'd get if there are species struggling for survival in an evolution of a species, or weeds in a paddock, or a market phenomena, such as the replacement of butter by margarine as a table spread, or the replacement of oil-based paints by water-based paints. Just look at it from this point of view. Here we are, we're the oil-based paint people, and there's the water-based paint coming along, and they're doing us in the eye and putting us out of business. Now, I can in other words, I recognise that as an evolution in the marketplace, and it's happened throughout history. And because of the huge populations involved, you can predict things fairly well. It's evolution. It's rough, but it's evolution at work. And this is one of our problems. Now, because I can then plot those as a ratio of one to the other. And if I do that and plot it on a log scale, I get this, and I draw your attention to the fact that I can now put world oil and world electricity consumption. Now just remember my chart where I showed you production, and the inputs were electricity and oil, for example, inputs into production. Because these are production and not related to the financial markets, they don't go up and down, they're as consistent as can be. There's electricity consumption, there's oil. Now that is 24 years of record. 24 years of record for the world, and I plot it on a straight line. The world is if you like, it's on, pardon me using the Asian expression now, but it's on track. And that's oil. And here are the poor countries growing like that. And these are a mirror image of it. This is a log scale, the ratio one to the other. So that's a ratio of this to them, and this is a ratio of them to that. So they're going like that. And you can see that round about the year 2015, the rich countries of the world and the poor countries of the world will have roughly the same industrial output. Same industrial. The poor countries and the rich countries will be roughly there. Remember that in 1970, and we were thinking everything was wonderful, the rich countries of the world were just about 9 times the poor countries of the world. And so we were, the colonial powers and everything else had all pitted in. 9 times then. How are we going to be when it's 1-to-1? And remember that it's 1-to-1, but this is 1 billion people, and this will be 6 billion people by then. And so they'll still be pretty poor on a per capita basis, and they'll just keep on going. And whereas once upon a time, it was 9-to-1 in our favour, when we get over here, it's going to be 9-to-1 in their favour. And they'll still be growing. Well, if I'm wrong, come and tell me. But, I'll make it, okay. Well, now, you can see that gives me mechanisms whereby I can look at the world. Now, I'm sorry to go from, this is a market share ratio thing, but you can see the way oil and electricity are on track. This enables me to also look at the dominant economies, and you can see what's happening. On this same sort of concept, Europe has been on a straight line for 40 years. It's steadily going down, and Europe could be facing problems. Japan has been on a fairly steady course. Asia, excluding Japan, is growing very nicely, thank you. And an interesting thing here appeared round about there. The end of the Cold War. And what happened with the end of the Cold War? Russia disappeared into oblivion, and the United States got a little fillip upwards, but they've been on a fairly steady basis ever since, and they've been growing at the average rate of the world. If it's a horizontal line, it's growing at the average rate of the world. Japan has been growing at the average rate of the world, Europe's in decline, and the former Russia is headed into the doldrums. And you can see it's a terribly serious state of affairs. But it's also easy to look at that and say, well, the next cab, as this lot gets stronger and stronger, the next cab off the rank to disappear down the gurgler could be Europe, or it could be Australia. That's the pressure, the reality of the pressure in the world. And so if you want to see what the world looks like in regions, this is the way it goes. And there's North America again, Europe, Asia, former Russia, Latin America is growing nicely. Eastern Europe has collapsed a bit. There's Australia, we're flattening off and nosediving a bit at the end there now. And there's the Middle East. So the growth is Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And they're in strife, Europe's in strife, and these people are trying to maintain their position. And this gives you a very nice thing. Well, now let's get back to the Asian Express. And how do we relate to the ASEAN 6 and Australia? And there we are. Now, it doesn't require an awful lot of imagination, does it, to work out that these people are heading in different directions. Now, I don't have to make projections now. That's just raw data. No fiddles, they're just the numbers. I punch them through my computer. Every year I put in an extra year of data, and there it is. I don't have to make any projections, any comments. That's raw data. Just look at the raw data, and what do you say to yourself? Where is Australia going? Where is ASEAN 6 going? What does that mean to the future of the nation? What does that mean for defence? And a few other things besides. So there they are, and let us assume that they're up there by the year 2020, and they're there. That's a ratio of about 7 or 8 to 1. So as far as the ASEAN 6, remember we're aid givers. In Australia we give aid, but they help these developing nations. So we are equal. In 1991, by the year 2020, they can be 8 times our size. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to plan the future of this nation? What populations do we have? Can we afford native title under those circumstances? What is our strategic position? What are we going to do about the development of the nation? So, okay, you can see I can divide the world into growing sections. Now let's come down and further with our microscope. Remember, we're the man from Mars, and we now look at Australia. And whereas Australia as a whole is like that, I can, in the same way as I can divide the world into the rich and the poor, I can divide Australia into older industrial Australia and newer industrial Australia. Does that surprise you? No. Here's older industrial Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, South Australia and the ACT, and newer industrial Australia. Are you surprised at that at all? Right. In other words, on this data, you can see from 1970 on, this could be the era of Joe Balky-Peterson and Charles Court, I don't know. But these states have grown, and they have, just look at the fact it's been a straight line for the last 30 years. Now, the interesting thing is that the feds have problems with taxation on this. Because one of the things they're trying to do is to tax this lot and subsidise that lot because of the decline of their industries. So we have a situation where industries are declining in Victoria and New South Wales. And, BHP Steel is a good example in New South Wales, the problems there. And so governments are minded to subsidise these contractions, and in order to do, they tax that. Now, you've got to look at native title in respect to that graph. Now, why is that so? Look at what native title is. Native title is essentially the creation of a situation where the Aboriginal community have been given the right to extract rent for the use of Crown land by other people. In other words, native title is a device to privatise Aboriginal welfare. It's the privatisation of Aboriginal welfare whereby the Aboriginals have a private stream of income from the private sector. And what parts of Australia are going to meeting that? This part of Australia are paying those taxes in order to subsidise that part there. So I see native title as a sort of a device whereby to redistribute the responsibility for Aboriginal welfare and put it on the mining companies and the pastoral interests in Western Australia and Queensland. And I think if you had a referendum in Western Australia or Queensland, they would vote 80 to 90% for the abolition of native title. And my correspondence with a member of the High Court has indicated to me that the High Court of Australia would be delighted to have the opportunity to rethink their Mabo legislation. They didn't, well, no, but you see, they haven't got the powers to do it unless somebody refers it to them. And that's politically difficult at the moment. But the High Court, I think, would not apply the Mabo judgment to continental Australia, mainland Australia. Remember, the Mabo decision was a Murray Island decision, and I think the High Court would be only too happy to make it plain that it didn't apply in continental Australia. They've got themselves in an awkward situation at the moment. And so, now, because I'm heading off to Western Australia, and I'm going to be presenting this data before the Premier of Western Australia, I devised a little chart for him. Okay, there's Western Australia. Western Australia and its neighbours, you see. And what are the neighbours of Western Australia? South Australia on one side and Indonesia on the other. There's Indonesia. There's Victoria. And you notice we're going down now. You know, ever since we privatised, we're on. And here's Western Australia. So Western Australia is growing like that, Indonesia is growing like that. Now, they've got to think pretty carefully in Western Australia because they're getting a pretty powerful neighbour out there. And things are going to get grim. And so my final picture on this little homily, let's look at this in long term in relation to, not in market share ratios, which you can see is the device I use in order to clarify my own thinking and help. But when I put the numbers down, here's the future you have to plan for. Oh, can you hold that down? Thank you. This is raw data, and from there on is my projections. And you can see the work I've done, that projections are okay. And this is a year or so old. But there is Australia coming up and flattening off. There's USA and Japan. There's China, and there's Indonesia and Malaysia. Now just look at this and realise what this means. There's Australia, we could be coming up over here. There's Indonesia and Malaysia combined, they're up there. You don't have to think very hard to realise when they get to be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times our size, and they're our neighbour, and they're trading heavily in the world, and they've got sophisticated industries. They will be looking very interestedly at a vacant and underdeveloped Australia. My recommendation is we have to recognise the reality of that. There is no alternative to getting back to work. Not only populating, let's make the people that are here now work. There's too many people unemployed and underemployed and doing trivial things. And so there's a lot of work to be done. I'm saying that the projects that I've been indicating to you, there's no shortage of cash in the private sector. We just have to get approval of governments to get on with the job. If we get on with the job, we'll employ an awful lot of people. It's going to be in our interest to do that because things are going to get tougher. Thank you very much. Dr. John Bradfield, many years ago, and I think it's about 50 or 60 years ago now, was coming up with proposals for the inland diversion of waters, the Clarence and further Burdekin and so on. I've been having a look at those various projects, and I can see that up until now it has not been economic to go to all the expense of diverting those waters, primarily because of this tyranny of distance problem. In other words, what would be the point of diverting the Burdekin inland if you're going to try and use that water to grow cotton, for example? But you change the transport system and you change the value of water and things change enormously. One of our problems at the moment in the Murray-Darling Basin generally, but this applies elsewhere, is that because we've had such low value on the crops and low value of water, there's been enormous waste of existing present available waters, and we've used flood-type irrigation. Now, in the irrigation areas in Australia, we use unlined channels, unlined canals, we use unlined distribution systems, and we use flood-type irrigation, even for grazing. In other words, we go to all the expense of putting in an irrigation system, and we use flood-type grazing, and we have cows on it. And so there's been enormous waste of water. If you change the transport system and you can market fresh fruit and vegetables, all of a sudden the land is more valuable, the water is more valuable, and the farmers are telling me it could be 5 times more valuable than it is at the moment. It becomes economic to line the channels, it becomes economic to use pipe distribution systems, and our irrigation systems could change from the wasteful things we've got now to something more like they have in Israel, where Israel is supplying the European market with fresh fruit and vegetables. Australia could be supplying an Asian market, a huge Asian market with fresh fruit and vegetables. So by changing the transport system, we change the value of water, we change the value of land. All of a sudden it becomes economic to do the things that Bradfield was talking about. And so I'm anticipating that all sorts of people will be looking at all sorts of projects around the continental divide, and they'll put a little dam here and tip of which bit of water over the edge and so on. So the inland system will move. I'm also looking at some of the Queensland rivers that flow into the Gulf of Carpentaria. There's a big area up there which has great irrigation potential, but it's, there's access to markets. Change the access to markets, and all of a sudden there's an irrigation potential on the on the Gulf of Carpentaria slopes of Queensland.
Have you, Professor, also heard of Watering Australia project?
Yes, Ernie Bridge, and yeah, I've met Ernie Bridge, and Ernie Bridge's major interest has been the Fitzroy, and I'm very seriously interested in the Fitzroy, and as I've indicated, that's likely to go ahead. And Ernie, he rather likes the sound of what's going ahead because he can see all his Aboriginal mates suddenly becoming terribly rich, and the idea of the private sector taking on the job and entering into private negotiations with the Aboriginals really cheers Ernie Bridge's heart. It's not the sort of way I would like to go.
Professor, can I ask a question? Because I have a very comprehensive understanding of LaRouche's physical economics.
Right.
What you represented in the graph there, the production aspect, he totally
Sure.
agree with. Your graphs, the logarithmic curves, projecting linear
Sort of them, yeah.
are absolutely correct. If there is no major turbulence within the entire order of what we've had within the population today. Now, what LaRouche has been saying, and in his line 9 forecast, is that the world has become so dominated by this financial speculative bubble that we're into the potential of a total meltdown of the financial system, which will have ramifications in the physical economy, which means we're not necessarily going to get a linear potential population, but a hyperbolic drop.
Yes.
So I just wanted to find out what you think on that, because just to give you some more background, LaRouche has mapped out that over the last 600 years we had a hyperbolic growth, more than hyperbolic growth of the population. He's saying if you take away the physical parameters to support the population, as is happening all around the world, you'll see a hyperbolic decrease in population due to the outbreak of famines and so forth. So I just wondering if you could make some comments on that.
Well, as I indicated, the population of the world is increasing by 80 million a year, and there's an awful lot of determined people out there. And I'm a bit of an optimist in that I am worried about the financial bubble, because I think it is likely to be pricked, and that worries me because of my investments, and I hope that because of that, I don't hold any shares in industrial companies in Australia, except for Adelaide Brighton, and I've simply invested on oil and gas in the ground, and gold and zinc and copper and what have you, the sort of things that are needed in long term by the growing populations in the world. And so yes, almost. But I am quite seriously anticipating that there is going to be a dislocation in the world financial markets. I cannot tell how that's going to go. On the other hand, I do then look at places like China and Malaysia and what have you. But China is a good example. A highly controlled economy or autocratic governments, they are likely to be able to resist the speculative bubble and the impact of it more than anybody else. So it could be that the financial bubble, the collapse of the financial bubble, is going to hurt the rich people of the world, whereas the poor people of the world haven't got much to lose, and they're just going to keep on working hard. And so we're going to see industry continuing in China and India, and those people will be working hard and trying to develop their nations and everything else. The financial collapse is going to be America, Australia, Europe, and I just instinctively feel that the potential for problems is greater in Europe than elsewhere, and I see Europe the first casualty, and then I fear for Australia because we haven't got the capacity to mobilise the nation effectively. So yes, I see a financial problem occurring. Yes, I see it occurring primarily in the rich countries of the world, and I see the poor countries of the world just steadily on course because they haven't got much to lose and they're just going to get on with it.
It's been an inspiration to listen to you.
Oh, thank you.
Look, we started some 8-10 years ago with the concept of infrastructure development to generate growth and productivity to kickstart the economy.
Yeah.
Steadily we've gone along with young people, old people who see us in the room and there's others.
Sure.
And the concepts that you presented here today is absolutely overwhelming for all of us, I think you'd agree with that, because I've been poking around this country looking for someone with half a brain, and I really haven't been. And I'm a central Queenslander, so but as we all understand, and is to make an economy work, water, transportation, energy, and of course people, and exactly what you're on about. And I thank you deeply from here for doing what you've done
Thank you.
today, and it's been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. All right.